An old rock band vanished without a trace in 1993 while aboard their private yacht, leaving the music world in shock. But 12 years later, the Navy pulls something from the ocean depths, and what they discover changes everything. The morning rain tapped against the bedroom window as Lisa Miller watched her husband pack. Jack folded a worn flannel shirt with surprising care before tucking it into his duffel bag alongside 3 composition notebooks. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. "You're sure it's just a week?" Lisa asked, bouncing 3-year-old Emma on her hip. "The label's been pushing you guys pretty hard lately." Jack zipped the bag closed before answering. 7 days on the yacht, that's it. Frank says Sony wants the new tracks by the end of the month." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth, which he carefully buried at the bottom of his bag when he thought Lisa wasn't looking. 5-year-old Ryan burst into the room, clutching a plastic dinosaur. "Daddy, can I come on the boat too? I won't touch anything, promise." Jack knelt down, ruffling his son's hair. "Not this time, buddy. This is work. But when I get back, we'll go fishing at the lake, just you and me." He pulled both children into a tight embrace, holding them longer than usual. Over their heads, his eyes met Lisa's with an expression she couldn't quite read. Next door, Dave Thornton was having a similar conversation with his wife Sarah, who cradled their newborn son against her shoulder. "I don't like this yacht idea, Dave," Sarah said, patting the baby's back gently. "Why can't you rent a beach house like last time? At least there'd be phone service." Dave carefully placed his Gibson Les Paul in its case. "The Dark Waters is Frank's gift to us. It would be an insult not to use it." He snapped the case shut. "Besides, no distractions means we finish the album faster." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Since when do you care about pleasing Frank so much?" Dave avoided her gaze. "It's complicated. The label, expectations are high after Midnight Demons went platinum." Across town, in his sleek downtown office, Frank Matthews paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. "They'll be on the boat in 2 days, he snapped. "I don't care what you think. The deal is done." He paused, listening. "No, they don't suspect anything. They think it's just a writing retreat." He glanced at the framed platinum record on his wall before adding, "Just make sure the captain knows the exact coordinates." On August 17th, a crowd of eager fans gathered at the Key West Marina despite the early hour. Someone had leaked information about the band's departure, and now dozens of people clutched vinyl copies of Midnight Demons and disposable cameras. The 5 members of Crimson Edge arrived in a black van, their long hair and casual clothes a stark contrast to the yacht's polished elegance. Jack Miller and Dave Thornton nodded to the fans, while Mike Reynolds, Steve Wilson, and Connor Thompson posed for photos, raising bottles of Jack Daniels in mock salute. "To immortality!" Mike shouted, causing the others to laugh and clink their bottles together. Jack broke away from the group briefly when he noticed a man in a gray suit standing apart from the crowd. They spoke in hushed tones, ending with a tense, formal handshake before Jack rejoined his bandmates. Frank Matthews arrived last, sunglasses hiding his eyes as he strode down the dock. He pulled Captain Robert Finch aside, speaking in a low voice. "Remember, follow exactly the coordinates I provided. No improvising." Frank handed him a sealed envelope. "And call only at the scheduled times." Finch, a middle-aged man with a weathered face but surprisingly few sailing calluses, nodded solemnly. "Understood, Mr. Matthews. Though I should mention, that route takes us closer to Cuban waters than might be comfortable." Frank's expression hardened. "Just follow the coordinates." As the Dark Waters pulled away from the dock, the 5 musicians lined the rail, waving to the crowd. Jack's eyes scanned the faces until he found Lisa and the children at the edge of the pier. He blew a kiss, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. At 10:43 that night, Lisa jumped at the sound of the marine radio crackling to life. She rushed to answer it, heart pounding. "The sky out here is amazing, baby," Jack's voice came through, breaking up slightly. "It feels like the stars are swallowing us." "How's the writing going?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "We've barely started. Listen, I can't talk long. Conservation of power and all that. I'll call tomorrow, same time. Kiss the kids for me." The call ended abruptly. Lisa stood by the silent radio for several minutes, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. 3 days passed with no further communication. Lisa tried repeatedly to reach the yacht, but only static answered her calls. When she phoned Frank's office, his secretary put her on hold for 20 minutes before Frank finally picked up. "They're composing, Lisa," he said, irritation evident in his voice. "That's what they went for. Stop calling every 5 minutes." By the 5th day of silence, Lisa and Sarah confronted Frank in person, barging into his Seattle office. "Either you contact the Coast Guard now, or we will," Lisa demanded, hands trembling with anger and fear. Frank's resistance crumbled under their combined determination, and he reluctantly made the call. Lieutenant Mark Rodriguez of the Florida Coast Guard initiated standard search procedures, dispatching alerts to vessels in the area and sending reconnaissance aircraft to fly over the yacht's projected route. Days of intensive searching yielded nothing. No distress signals, no debris, no oil slicks, not even a life jacket. 1 week after the disappearance, the Coast Guard's waiting room had become a makeshift command center for the families. Lisa sat with Ryan asleep in her lap, while Sarah paced with her fussy infant. The mothers of Mike and Steve sat together, sharing tissues, while Connor's father stared blankly at the local news broadcast covering the story. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered the room, his face grave. He asked for privacy, waiting until a junior officer ushered out the handful of reporters who had been keeping vigil with the families. "In 15 years of service," Rodriguez said once the door closed, "I've never seen anything like this. A yacht that size couldn't simply evaporate without leaving evidence of a wreck unless someone wanted very badly for it to disappear." The words hung in the air of the Coast Guard's waiting room, landing with devastating weight on the assembled families. Lisa clutched Ryan closer to her chest, the boy still mercifully asleep despite Lieutenant Rodriguez's grim assessment. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" Connor's father asked, breaking the stunned silence. Rodriguez spread his hands across the maritime chart on the table. A vessel of that size would leave something behind: debris, oil slicks, life jackets. We've covered over 10,000 square nautical miles and found literally nothing. "So someone wanted them to disappear," Sarah whispered, her baby finally quiet against her shoulder. "But who? And why?" The following days brought a media frenzy as news outlets across the country seized on the mysterious vanishing of one of rock's most successful bands. Theories proliferated wildly, from catastrophic structural failure to drug-fueled suicide pacts. Every morning, a new headline seemed to offer a different explanation. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Lisa boarded a flight back to Seattle, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Emma slept against her shoulder, while Ryan silently flipped through a music magazine featuring his father's face on the cover beneath bold letters proclaiming "Rock's Greatest Mystery." "Is Daddy a mystery now?" Ryan asked, his small finger tracing Jack's photographed face. Lisa swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart. Daddy's just lost, and they're going to keep looking until they find him." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. In Portland, Sarah arrived at her parents' suburban home to find the sidewalk crowded with reporters shouting questions about conspiracy theories and suicide pacts. Her father forced a path through them, while her mother shielded the baby from the camera flashes. "Did they plan this disappearance?" one reporter called out. "Was the band involved with Cuban drug smugglers?" shouted another. Sarah's father slammed the door behind them, shutting out the cacophony. "Vultures," he muttered, "all of them." By October, the financial realities of Jack's absence began to bear down on Lisa. Seated at her kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, she tried to focus despite the constant ringing of the phone. Reporters mostly, though occasionally friends or distant relatives seeking gossip disguised as concern. On the television in the corner, MTV was airing yet another special about Crimson Edge, showing footage from their last Seattle concert. Lisa reached for the remote when the program cut to a press conference. Frank Matthews stood before a forest of microphones at Sony Music's New York headquarters, his expression appropriately somber. "We are all devastated by the loss of these talented artists," he said. "The album Lost at Sea is our way of honoring their legacy." Lisa froze. This was the first she'd heard of any album release. The following weekend, she drove to the local record store and stood in silence before a massive display featuring Lost at Sea, a compilation of demos, alternate takes, and previously unreleased tracks. The cover showed all 5 band members standing on the yacht's deck, their hair blowing in the wind, bottles raised in a toast to the camera. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she realized Frank hadn't bothered to inform her of the release, much less discuss royalties. At the FBI field office in Seattle, Special Agent Thomas Cooper pinned another document to the investigation board that had consumed an entire wall of his office. At 53, Cooper was a methodical investigator with a reputation for solving cold cases. His colleagues had initially been surprised when he requested the Crimson Edge case, not realizing his own son had been a devoted fan. Cooper stepped back, studying the timeline he'd constructed. Something didn't add up. He picked up his phone and dialed a number in Key West. "Captain Finch, this is Agent Cooper again. I need you to explain once more why the yacht changed its planned route at the last minute." The captain's answers were unsatisfying, evasive. Cooper made a note to interview him in person. Lisa's attempts to reach Frank grew increasingly frustrating. His secretary had perfected the art of the brush-off. "Mr. Matthews is in meetings with new talent and can't be disturbed." After the 10th such call in a month, Cooper suggested they meet at a quiet cafe away from both the FBI office and Lisa's home. "The record company is blocking my requests for access to contracts and financial records," he explained, keeping his voice low despite the nearly empty establishment. "That's not standard procedure in missing persons cases." "What are they hiding?" Lisa asked, stirring her untouched coffee. "That's what we need to find out." 1 year after the disappearance, a memorial service was held for Connor Thompson at a beach in his hometown. His parents released flowers into the sea while Lisa and Sarah watched from a distance, uncomfortable with what felt like surrender. Later that evening, all the families gathered in a hotel conference room for what became a tense confrontation. "We need to accept that they're gone, Lisa," Steve Wilson's sister said, her voice breaking. "We can't live in this limbo forever." "Without bodies, without proof, I'm not declaring Jack dead," Lisa shot back. "How do I explain that to my children if someday he comes back?" The division between those who accepted the presumed deaths and those who still hoped grew wider. Meanwhile, financial pressures mounted. Without death certificates, the wives couldn't access life insurance policies or resolve inheritance issues. Sony kept all royalties in escrow accounts, citing legal uncertainty. In spring of 1995, a momentary flicker of hope arose when a Cuban fisherman found a leather boot that matched the description of what Mike Reynolds had been wearing. The FBI sent agents to examine the item, but forensic analysis proved inconclusive. Sarah checked her mailbox one morning to find another letter from the bank threatening foreclosure. Inside, she sank to the kitchen floor, wondering how her life had come to this. A single mother with mounting debts and a husband who existed in some terrible state between life and death. That evening, while the children slept, Lisa found herself scrolling through a website called EdgeNotDead.com, reading through conspiracy theories and alleged sightings of the musicians around the world. Part of her knew it was unhealthy, but she couldn't stop searching for any thread of hope, no matter how thin. While the FBI continued pressing Frank Matthews for more information, the music manager finally relented in 1997, handing over a folder containing shocking financial documents. The Crimson Edge members, particularly Jack and Dave, had accumulated gambling debts in Las Vegas. More than $2.5 million owed to people with organized crime connections. The headline in the Seattle Times blared across the breakfast table where Lisa sat with her coffee. "Gambling debts may explain Crimson Edge mystery." Beneath it, grainy photos showed Jack and Dave at a Las Vegas casino, chips stacked high before them. Lisa's hands trembled as she read the article, which quoted, unnamed sources close to the investigation, claiming the band members had fled to escape debts to organized crime figures. "Mom, is that Dad?" Ryan asked, peering over her shoulder at the newspaper. Lisa quickly folded it away. "Yes, sweetie, just an old picture." The revelations about gambling debts created an immediate rift among the families. 2 days later, in a downtown Seattle restaurant, Mike Reynolds' mother slammed her palm on the table, eyes burning with accusation. "You haven't understood anything, have you?" she shouted at Lisa and Sarah. "Your husbands sacrificed my son to save their own skins." Her voice carried across the restaurant, turning heads at nearby tables. "That's not what happened," Lisa responded, keeping her voice level despite the turmoil inside. "If they wanted to disappear, why take the others? It makes no sense." The meeting ended with bitter words and slammed doors. Driving home, Lisa made a decision. The next morning, she walked into a modest office in downtown Seattle, where Martin Reeves, a former Seattle homicide detective turned private investigator, greeted her with a firm handshake. "I'm not looking for validation, Mr. Reeves," Lisa said, sitting across from his cluttered desk. "I want the truth, whatever it is." Reeves, a stocky man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and perceptive eyes, studied her for a moment before nodding. "The FBI hasn't found answers in 4 years. What makes you think I can?" "Because you don't have bureaucracy holding you back," Lisa replied, "and because you have a reputation for seeing what others miss." Reeves began by analyzing photographs of the band's last public appearances, spreading them across his desk while Lisa watched. "Look at their faces," he said, pointing to a particular shot taken at the dock. "I don't see men planning an escape. I see men under pressure, yes, but there's something else here, almost like resignation." Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, Agent Cooper sat surrounded by bankers' boxes containing the case files. For hours, he meticulously noted inconsistencies in Frank Matthews' statements over the years, creating a timeline of contradictions that pointed to deliberate deception rather than simple memory lapses. Cooper's attempts to access the band's complete financial records hit another wall during a frustrating meeting with Sony Music executives. A corporate lawyer interrupted almost every question. "These contracts contain proprietary information that goes beyond the scope of your investigation." "5 men are missing," Cooper countered, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. "Their families deserve answers." "And they'll get them," the lawyer replied smoothly, "through appropriate legal channels." Back in Seattle, Lisa sat on the edge of Ryan's bed, watching her 12-year-old son struggle to reproduce chords from a Crimson Edge song on a second-hand guitar. When he finally hit the right sequence, tears welled in her eyes. "That sounds just like him," she whispered. Ryan looked up, his father's eyes staring back at her from a face growing more like Jack's every day. "Do you think he can hear me playing, wherever he is?" The following morning, Sarah received a call from her son's kindergarten teacher. "He drew his family again, Mrs. Thornton," the teacher explained gently. "His father is still depicted as a figure in the sky, not in the sea as others had suggested to him." That evening, Lisa met Cooper in a park, far from curious eyes and potential listening devices. "The sound technician who was going to testify," Lisa said, watching ducks glide across the pond. "You really believe that wasn't an accident?" Cooper sighed heavily. Carl Jenkins was the only person who worked with the band during their final recording sessions willing to speak openly. The day before his scheduled interview, his car goes off Highway 101 with no skid marks, no mechanical failures, perfect weather conditions. He paused. "I've been a federal agent for 27 years, Mrs. Miller. I don't believe in that kind of coincidence." Television news that evening reported Jenkins' death with clinical detachment. Carl Jenkins, 38, died instantly when his car left the road on Highway 101. Authorities do not suspect foul play. Reeves's investigation continued to uncover inconsistencies in the gambling debt narrative. After interviewing a former employee of the Sands Casino in Las Vegas, he called Lisa immediately. "Jack Miller was a terrible gambler," Reeves reported, "but this source never saw him or Dave wager sums that would justify debts of that magnitude." Someone's inflating numbers, creating a convenient explanation. By 1998, financial pressures forced Lisa to sell the family home. Ryan and Emma watched silently as the moving truck loaded their possessions, neighbors pretending not to stare from behind curtains and fences. "Where will Dad find us when he comes back?" Emma asked, clutching a stuffed animal Jack had given her. Lisa knelt to eye level with her daughter. "We'll make sure he knows where we are." Late that night, Cooper sat in his home office, walls covered with photos and documents from the case. His wife entered, wrapping her robe tightly around herself. "Tom, it's 2 a.m, she said softly. "You need to let this go. You're retiring next year." Cooper shook his head, eyes fixed on a photo of the 5 musicians. "These men didn't vanish without reason. Their families deserve answers before I turn in my badge." On Ryan's 12th birthday, he visited the local music store, staring reverently at a framed Crimson Edge poster. "Your dad was one of the greats, kid," the shopkeeper commented, recognizing him. "That voice, raw but melodic, you know? They don't make 'em like that anymore." 5 years after the disappearance, with the case officially classified as inactive, pending new information, Cooper continued investigating in his free time, the obsession only growing as his retirement approached. In June of 2005, Cooper, now gray-haired and less than 6 months from retirement, received a confidential envelope from a Navy contact. Opening it with practiced care, he found underwater photographs showing an intact yacht resting on the ocean floor. With trembling hands, Cooper enhanced the images on his computer, zooming in on specific details. His blood ran cold as he recognized what he was seeing. The water intake valves of the dark waters were visibly open. The yacht hadn't sunk in an accident. It had been deliberately submerged. And most disturbing of all, there were no bodies aboard. Cooper stared at the computer screen, the implications of what he was seeing washing over him like ice water. The yacht, perfectly intact except for the deliberately opened valves, represented not an accident or tragedy, but an intentional disappearance. The next morning, Cooper placed a carefully worded call to Lisa Miller, asking her to meet him immediately at a secure location. His tone left no room for questions. Within hours, Lisa and Sarah found themselves being ushered into a windowless conference room deep within the Seattle FBI field office. "I've swept for listening devices," Cooper said, closing the door and dimming the lights. "What I'm about to show you doesn't officially exist yet." He connected his laptop to a projector, casting ghostly blue-tinged images of the sunken yacht onto the wall. "The dark waters," Lisa whispered, leaning forward. "Where did you find it?" U.S. Navy divers located it during a routine training exercise near the maritime border with Cuba, Cooper explained, zooming in on specific details. "Look here. These are the water intake valves. They're in the open position." Sarah gasped. "You mean?" "Someone deliberately sank that boat," Cooper confirmed. "And there's more. No bodies were found aboard. None." The women sat in stunned silence as Cooper continued explaining the complexity of the recovery operation. The yacht rested at 900 feet, in disputed waters between American and Cuban territorial claims. Political complications were delaying a full recovery effort. "Commander Robert Hayes from the Navy briefed me personally," Cooper said, bringing up another slide. "The yacht is in a remarkably preserved state at that depth and temperature, almost like a time capsule." Lisa's mind raced. If they sank the boat themselves, then they're still alive, Sarah finished, her voice a mixture of hope and bewilderment. Within days, news of the discovery leaked to the press. Ryan Miller, now 17 and bearing an increasingly strong resemblance to his father, became obsessed with every detail released to the public. His bedroom walls, once covered with posters of his father's band, now featured a complex web of notes, newspaper clippings, and red string connecting various theories. "This proves what you always believed, Mom," Ryan said, tracing a line between 2 photographs. "Dad didn't die in an accident. They planned this." While Lisa tried to temper her son's renewed obsession, diplomatic negotiations continued behind closed doors. At the Cuban embassy in Washington, American diplomats pressed their case for access to the wreck site. "This is a matter of missing American citizens," a State Department official insisted, "not an intelligence operation." The Cuban representatives remained skeptical, but eventually agreed to limited access, provided their own observers could participate in the recovery operation. One evening, Lisa and Emma, now a quiet 15-year-old who barely remembered her father, watched the evening news together when the story broke nationally. "Sources confirm that the yacht of rock band Crimson Edge has been located intact," the anchor announced gravely. "The FBI has declined to comment on what this might mean for the investigation into their disappearance 12 years ago." Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "Does this mean Dad might be coming home?" Lisa could only offer a tearful smile in response. The deepwater recovery operation began 3 weeks later. ROVs, remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras, entered the yacht's interior, transmitting real-time footage to a Navy vessel floating above. In the ship's control room, officers and investigators watched in stunned silence as the cameras revealed an interior preserved like a museum exhibit. Personal belongings still in place, instruments untouched, even half-empty whiskey bottles on a table. Everything except the men themselves. Cooper methodically examined the inventory of recovered items. 5 passports with false names, he noted, spreading photographs across Lisa's kitchen table. Canadian identities, but the photos are clearly Jack and the others. They planned this for months, maybe longer. Ryan, who had insisted on being present, studied the passport images. "Dad wouldn't abandon us without a really serious reason," he said firmly. "Something forced them to do this, Mom." Sarah Thornton, reviewing her own husband's documents, suddenly remembered something. Dave mentioned strange meetings the band was having, not with record executives, but with guys in suits who talked about the cultural importance of American music. This new detail sent Cooper back through his files, searching for similar references in his interviews. Meanwhile, a Washington Post journalist began digging into Frank Matthews' past, uncovering connections that had eluded investigators for years. Her computer screen filled with archived documents. Frank Matthews, Cultural Consultancy for State Department, 1983-1988. Coinciding with the intensification of the Cuban embargo. When confronted by reporters outside a Los Angeles restaurant, Matthews ducked into his waiting car. "I have no comment on absurd conspiracy theories," he shouted through a closing window. Back in Seattle, Lisa, Sarah, and Cooper examined the coded documents recovered from the yacht. "These look like geographic coordinates," Cooper observed, comparing them to maps. "All within Cuban territory." Ryan made his own discovery while searching through his father's old possessions in storage, a notebook containing unreleased lyrics with verses about changing skin and living under foreign stars. The case took a dramatic turn when Mexican authorities apprehended Robert Finch, the captain hired to navigate the dark waters. Living under a false identity in Puerto Vallarta, Finch was extradited to the United States. During his interrogation, he revealed information that changed everything. "They paid me to take the band to specific coordinates and then abandon the boat in an inflatable," Finch admitted, perspiration beading on his forehead under the interrogation room lights. "The men who hired me weren't from the record company. They identified themselves as security consultants for the American government." Finch's revelation sent shockwaves through the FBI. Within hours, a task force was assembled to investigate possible connections between the disappearance and unauthorized government operations. Cooper, though technically approaching retirement, was kept on as a special consultant due to his unparalleled knowledge of the case. "Government security consultants," Cooper muttered, pacing his office. "That fits with Matthews' State Department background and the Cuban coordinates. This wasn't about gambling debts. It was something official, or at least semi-official." The investigation took an unexpected turn when Lisa discovered a new book during her weekly visit to the bookstore. There on the front table, prominently displayed, was a volume titled Subversive Notes, The CIA and the Cultural War Against Cuba by Harris Thompson, identified as a retired CIA agent. The cover featured stylized images of musical instruments intertwined with espionage symbols. Flipping through the pages with trembling hands, Lisa found an entire chapter dedicated to Crimson Edge. They weren't the first band approached, Thompson wrote, but they were the first to accept. The operation aligned with the Clinton administration's policy of cultural engagement with Cuba while maintaining the economic embargo. Lisa purchased the book immediately and called Cooper and Sarah to meet at her apartment that evening. Ryan, now legally an adult at 18, insisted on being included in the discussion. He sat cross-legged on the floor, devouring Thompson's book with intense concentration, marking pages with adhesive notes as connections formed in his mind. This Project Harmony allegedly recruited American musicians as cultural agents, Cooper summarized after reading the relevant chapter. According to Thompson, they were given basic espionage training and sent to Cuba with false identities to establish contacts with Cuban youth and organize underground concerts to spread Western values. On television, the CIA issued its standard response. The agency neither confirms nor denies allegations regarding specific past or present operations. The State Department dismissed the book as sensationalist fiction from a disgruntled former employee. The following day, Lisa and Sarah met with Senator Eleanor Mitchell from Washington State, who had taken an interest in their case after her own son, a journalist, highlighted the political implications. "I'll demand an investigation into this alleged Project Harmony," Mitchell promised, her office windows offering a view of the Capitol dome. "You deserve answers after all these years." That evening, Ryan sat at his computer, researching routes to Cuba through Canada, which maintained diplomatic relations with the island nation despite the American embargo. He printed maps of Havana and photographs of locations mentioned in the decoded documents from the yacht. When Lisa discovered his preparations, an emotional confrontation ensued. "I'm 18 now, Mom," Ryan insisted, standing his ground in their small apartment living room. "If the government won't give us answers, I'll find them myself." "It's too dangerous," Lisa countered, her voice breaking. "I've already lost your father to that place. I can't lose you too." Despite her objections, Ryan continued planning his journey, secretly meeting with Cooper at a park several days later. "Technically, I can't help you," the retired agent said, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "But, hypothetically, these contacts in Havana are reliable." He discreetly passed a folded paper to Ryan. "Your father might have met them during his time there." While Ryan prepared for his unauthorized investigation, Martin Reeves tracked down a studio technician who had worked with Crimson Edge during their final recording sessions. Meeting in a dimly lit bar far from the music industry haunts, the nervous man finally opened up after several drinks. "They recorded Spanish versions of some songs," he revealed, voice barely above a whisper. "Jack said it was for a special album for Latin America, but something felt off. They practiced Spanish phrases between takes, libertad, revolution, carefully pronouncing them while exchanging meaningful looks." This revelation aligned perfectly with the cultural agent theory presented in Thompson's book. Sarah, searching through Dave's old books that she'd kept in storage, found a note tucked between pages of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. "If I ever disappear, look for me where the waters are warmer and the music is freer." By the end of the summer, the FBI had finally deciphered the coded documents from the yacht. They contained detailed instructions for contacts in Havana and plans for a series of private concerts at specific locations. Also included was a list of dates for radio transmissions on predetermined frequencies, the last dated October 1993, 2 months after the disappearance. They were supposed to maintain contact, Cooper explained to Lisa and Sarah. Something interrupted the communications. Ryan continued his preparations, carefully packing his backpack with essentials: family photos, his passport, and his father's old guitar pick preserved in a small plastic case. Cooper and Lisa had one final tense conversation before Ryan's departure. "I can't stop him, Tom," Lisa admitted, her face showing the strain of 12 years of uncertainty. Maybe he'll find answers that 15 years of official investigation couldn't. On the eve of Ryan's departure, an envelope without a return address arrived at the Miller home. Inside was a faded photograph showing 5 short-haired men sitting at an outdoor cafe in Cuba, their faces partially visible but unmistakable, and on the back, handwritten, Varadero, Cuba, 1998, 5 years after the supposed disappearance. Ryan stared at the photograph with trembling hands. The evidence of his father's survival 5 years after the disappearance, both validating and shocking. This was no longer about chasing ghosts. His father was alive, or at least had been in 1998. With renewed determination, he finished packing his backpack that night, the photograph safely tucked into a waterproof pouch alongside his documents. The Toronto airport bustled with morning travelers as Ryan checked in for his flight to Havana, his heart pounding as he presented his Canadian passport, a convincing forgery provided through Cooper's hypothetical contacts. Each step through security felt like walking on a tightrope, but his cover, as a music student visiting Cuba for cultural research, held firm. 3 hours later, the plane descended toward José Martí International Airport, revealing Havana's colorful sprawl against the Caribbean blue. Ryan pressed his face to the window, taking in the landscape that had somehow swallowed his father whole. The city below looked nothing like the isolated gray communist outpost depicted in American media. Instead, he saw vibrant buildings, classic cars, and beaches dotted with tourists. Passing through Cuban immigration proved less intimidating than he'd anticipated. The officer barely glanced at his Canadian passport before stamping it with practiced efficiency. Outside the terminal, Ryan hailed a taxi to take him to a small hotel in Old Havana that Cooper's contacts had recommended. The modest hotel room became his base of operations. Ryan unpacked methodically, spreading his resources across the bed: maps, coordinates from the decoded documents, the anonymous photograph, and a small notebook containing information compiled from Thompson's book and Cooper's intelligence. The faded photograph of the 5 men at the cafe in Varadero became his talisman, proof that his mission wasn't foolish or delusional. That evening, Ryan ventured into the heart of Old Havana, the colonial architecture and narrow streets creating an atmosphere both foreign and somehow familiar, perhaps because his father had walked these same paths. He entered a small music venue where tourists and locals mingled, ordering a beer in halting Spanish and finding a corner table where he could observe without drawing attention. When a local band took a break, Ryan struck up a conversation, casually mentioning American bands from the 90s. The musicians responded enthusiastically about Nirvana and Pearl Jam, but when Ryan mentioned Crimson Edge, their expressions changed subtly, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "Good band," one guitarist said carefully. "Not so famous here." The next morning, Ryan boarded a crowded bus at Havana's central terminal bound for Trinidad, a colonial town in central Cuba mentioned in the decoded documents. A tourism official watched him with particular interest as he boarded, making a note in a small book. Ryan pretended not to notice, reminding himself that foreign travelers were likely monitored routinely in Cuba. Trinidad's preserved colonial architecture made it feel like stepping back in time. Ryan checked into a Casa Particular, a licensed private home offering rooms to tourists, and spent the afternoon exploring the cobblestone streets, comparing landmarks to the coordinates in his notes. That evening, he located a small music venue where locals gathered. After listening for an hour, Ryan asked the house guitarist if he could play a few songs. With the borrowed instrument in hand, he began with some recognizable American rock tunes before subtly transitioning into the opening chords of Midnight Shadows, one of Crimson Edge's less-known tracks, presenting it as if it were his own improvisation. The reaction was immediate. Most patrons continued their conversations, but an elderly man at the bar straightened, his attention suddenly fixed on Ryan. When the short set ended, the white-haired man approached. "Where did you learn that song, young man?" he asked in accented English. "It is not Cuban." Ryan's heart raced. "My father taught me," he replied carefully. "He loved American rock." The man who introduced himself as Eduardo studied Ryan's face intently. "You remind me of someone I knew many years ago. A music teacher, an American who came to give classes at the National School of Arts for a few months. Juan, he called himself." With hands that suddenly felt clumsy, Ryan withdrew the photograph, sliding it across the table. Was it any of these men? Eduardo adjusted his glasses, examining the image before nodding slowly. Yes, this one here. Juan, with his friends. They taught for a while at the school. The following morning, Ryan met Eduardo at a small outdoor cafe. The old man had once worked as an administrator at the National School of Arts and remembered the 5 Canadian music teachers who had arrived in 1993 with unusual enthusiasm for Cuban revolutionary music. They were different from other foreign teachers, Eduardo explained, very interested in meeting young musicians, especially those with, political opinions. Some students became quite close to them. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Lisa and Sarah sat rigidly in a stark meeting room at the State Department, facing impassive officials who revealed nothing in their expressions. "If our husbands were recruited by the American government, we have the legal right to know," Lisa insisted, Senator Mitchell sitting supportively beside them. "We have no record of any official engagement with the individuals in question," the senior official responded mechanically. That evening, Cooper received an encrypted message from Ryan. "Found someone who recognized them. Heading to Santa Clara tomorrow." The following day, Ryan traveled to Santa Clara, following Eduardo's suggestion that several students from that city had been particularly close to the foreign teachers. After a day of discreet inquiries, he discovered a connection to the coastal fishing village of Caibarien. Ryan hired a weathered taxi for the journey, the driver curious about what would bring a young Canadian tourist to such an out-of-the-way place. "My father visited here once," Ryan explained vaguely. "I want to see what he saw." In Caibarien's small local market, Ryan showed the photograph to vendors, meeting blank stares and shrugs until an elderly woman selling hand-woven baskets recognized it. "El Americano, el que toca guitarra," she said, pointing toward a dirt road leading away from the village. With directions from the woman and his heart hammering in his chest, Ryan walked the dusty path until he reached a simple house near the shore. In the yard, a middle-aged man was repairing a fishing net, his movements methodical and practiced. His hair, once long, was now short and graying, his skin bronzed by tropical sun. But when he looked up, the eyes, the same eyes Ryan saw in the mirror every morning, met his. For a moment that seemed eternal, father and son stared at each other in silence. "Ryan?" The voice was hoarser, with a slight accent that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably Jack Miller's, and when Ryan, paralyzed with emotion, finally managed to nod, Jack dropped the fishing net and murmured, "They finally found us then." For several heartbeats, father and son stood frozen in time, the Caribbean breeze the only movement between them. Then Ryan stumbled forward, closing the distance in 3 desperate steps. Jack dropped the fishing net completely, arms opening to receive his son. They collided in an embrace that contained 16 years of absence, questions dissolving momentarily in the simple reality of touch. "You're real," Ryan whispered, his voice breaking. "You're actually real." Jack's weathered hands gripped his son's shoulders, pulling back to study the young man's face. "Look at you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "A man now. My God." The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the modest wooden house in amber light as Jack led Ryan to the small veranda overlooking the sea. They sat on simple wooden chairs, the conversation halting and overwhelmed by the magnitude of their reunion. "I don't even know where to begin explaining 16 years of absence," Jack said, his hands trembling as he poured dark rum into 2 simple glasses. Ryan placed his backpack on the rough wooden table, removing items one by one. Family photographs, newspaper clippings about the disappearance, and the small notebook of lyrics he'd found in his father's studio. "Start anywhere," he said. "I've been looking for answers my whole life." Jack lifted the glass to his lips, taking a long drink before setting it down with deliberate care. "In the beginning, It seemed like an opportunity to do something important, he began, his voice low. The Cold War had ended, and we thought we could help open Cuba to the world through music. The story unfolded as night descended. Jack described clandestine meetings in nondescript Washington offices where men in suits explained their mission with maps and slides, presenting it as cultural diplomacy with a patriotic edge. "But why you?" Ryan asked, leaning forward. "Why the entire band? You had no experience in whatever this was." Jack's laugh held no humor. "That was exactly the point. Who would suspect rock musicians? We were the perfect cover, loud, visible, but simultaneously invisible." In the dim light of a single lamp, Jack described their hasty training at a secluded facility in Florida. 2 weeks of basic Spanish lessons, secure communication techniques, and instructions on gathering information without raising suspicions. "We believed we were cultural ambassadors," Jack continued, "spreading American ideals through music, identifying promising young Cubans who might become voices for democratic change." His expression darkened. Then Dave discovered that Ernesto, his 19-year-old student, had been arrested for counter-revolutionary activities the day after we mentioned his name in a report. The revelation had shattered their illusions. When they attempted to withdraw from the operation, their CIA handler showed them files containing detailed information about their families, Ryan, Emma, Sarah's baby, in what Jack recognized as a veiled threat. "We were trapped," Jack explained, refilling their glasses. "If we returned to the U.S., we'd be forced to continue or face consequences that would affect all of you. If we stayed as agents, more innocent people would suffer." Their unexpected salvation came from Miguel, a Cuban intelligence officer who had been monitoring them for months. Rather than exposing them, he offered a third option: new lives in Cuba, in exchange for information about CIA operations on the island. "It was the most difficult decision of our lives," Jack confessed, tears finally breaking through his composure. "Abandoning you, your mother, our music. But we were responsible for what had happened here. People were suffering because of us." The night deepened around them as Jack revealed how all 5 musicians had eventually formed new families in Cuba. From his wallet, he produced photos of his Cuban wife Maria, a literature professor, and 2 teenage children, Alejandro and Sofia. Ryan stared at the images, emotions warring across his face. "Mom never gave up," he said finally. "She believed in you for 16 years, while you built a new family here." "Not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you all," Jack responded, his voice breaking. "But after a few years, we convinced ourselves that it would be safer for you if we remained dead. Any contact risked exposing not just us, but placing you in danger as well." The first light of dawn was breaking when Jack led Ryan to a small room at the back of the house. Here, carefully preserved, was a collection of Crimson Edge memorabilia, magazine clippings, an old guitar, handwritten lyrics, a shrine to a life abandoned but never forgotten. Later that morning, Jack walked Ryan to a small boat repair shop near the harbor, where Dave Thornton, now with short graying hair and sun-weathered skin, was sanding the hull of a fishing boat. The reunion was emotional, but briefer, both men clearly stunned by Ryan's appearance in their carefully constructed world. As they walked back along the shore, Jack explained that Mike, Steve, and Connor also lived in Cuba, scattered across different provinces with their own families, meeting occasionally, but always discreetly. Ryan spent the day processing everything he'd learned, meeting Jack's Cuban children when they returned from school, teenagers who regarded him with cautious curiosity, this half-brother who had appeared from another world. That evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the veranda, Jack turned to face his son directly. "I want to know everything about your mother, about Emma. And I need to know, did you come just to find answers? Or is there any possibility of us returning home after all these years?" Ryan's question hung in the air between them as the last crimson rays of the Caribbean sunset painted the modest veranda. Jack studied his son's face, searching for an answer that could bridge 16 years of absence. "I didn't come just to find you. Ryan said finally. "I came to bring you home, if that's what you want." The following morning, Ryan accompanied his father on a walk through the fishing village. Kaibarien awakened slowly, fishermen preparing their boats while vendors arranged their wares in the small market. Jack greeted locals with easy familiarity, his Spanish flowing naturally as he introduced Ryan as his nephew from Canada, visiting for a few weeks. "Here I'm just Juan, the music teacher and net mender," Jack explained as they walked along the harbor. "It's a simple life, but there's freedom in simplicity." Ryan observed how completely his father had integrated into this community, so different from the rock star who had once commanded stadium stages. In these streets, Jack Miller had truly disappeared, replaced by Juan, the respected local who repaired fishing nets and taught children to play guitar. Later that afternoon, Ryan found a small internet cafe in the village center. With a carefully worded message, he established contact with Cooper. "All alive. Confirmed CIA involvement. Need to assess legal implications for return." The response came hours later. "Proceeding cautiously. Political climate complicated. Maintain low profile." That evening, Jack's Cuban family gathered for dinner, the atmosphere thick with unspoken questions. Maria, a dignified woman with intelligent eyes and silver-streaked black hair, served a traditional Cuban dish while teenagers Alejandro and Sofia observed Ryan with cautious curiosity. "Your mother was beautiful," Maria said suddenly, as Ryan showed them recent photos on his phone. "She still is. I see where you get your eyes." Ryan scrolled through images. Lisa in her nurse supervisor's uniform, Emma at her high school graduation. "Mom works as a nursing supervisor now. Emma's thinking about studying psychology." Jack held the photograph of Lisa displayed on the screen, emotion evident in his expression. "She looks stronger. She always was stronger than me." At dawn the next day, Ryan accompanied Dave Thornton to a quiet stretch of beach. The former guitarist, now a boat mechanic, explained the scattered existence of the band members in their new lives. "Mike's in Santiago, Steve in Pinar del Rio, and Connor near Matanzas," Dave said, skipping a stone across the calm morning water. "We see each other a few times a year, always discreetly. We've all built lives here, new families, new identities." "Do you regret it?" Ryan asked directly, "abandoning everything?" Jack, who had been quietly watching the horizon, answered instead. "I regret how it happened, not the decision itself. We saved lives by getting out of that game." Meanwhile in Seattle, Cooper explained the legal complexities to Lisa and Sarah in his home office, surrounded by case files that had consumed years of his career. "Technically, they could face treason charges," he said gravely, "but the coercive recruitment offers grounds for defense. The bigger issue might be the Cuban government's reaction. They granted asylum in exchange for intelligence." Across the country in his Malibu mansion, Frank Matthews paced nervously, phone pressed to his ear. "You don't understand," he hissed to the unseen caller. "If they return and talk, many powerful people will fall. This goes beyond a few musicians." Back in Washington, Lisa and Sarah met with Senator Eleanor Mitchell, a determined woman whose political career had been built on government accountability. "This is a historical injustice that needs correction," Mitchell stated firmly. "We can use this to initiate a review of unauthorized CIA operations. The timing is actually favorable. Relations with Cuba are thawing." In Kaibarien, Ryan spent an afternoon with Alejandro and Sofia, the three finding connection through music, despite language barriers. Jack's Cuban children had inherited his musical talent, Alejandro on guitar, and Sofia with a hauntingly beautiful singing voice reminiscent of the Cuban folk traditions she'd grown up with. Later, Jack showed Ryan a room at the back of the house where he kept carefully preserved Crimson Edge memorabilia, magazine clippings, an old guitar, handwritten lyrics, tangible links to his previous existence. "I couldn't bring myself to destroy everything," Jack explained, running his fingers over a faded band photograph. "This room is my confessional, I suppose." That evening, A tense moment occurred between Ryan and Maria as they prepared dinner while Jack visited a neighbor. "He never stopped loving your mother," Maria said suddenly, slicing vegetables with precise movements. "Every night on your birthdays, he would sit alone on the beach for hours. I never asked what he was thinking, but I knew." Later that night, using Cooper's secure phone connection, Ryan spoke briefly with his mother. "He wants to come back, Mom," Ryan said, emotion thickening his voice. "All of them do, but they're afraid of the consequences." Lisa's response was immediate. "Tell him we'll fight whatever comes. We've already lost 16 years. The conversation abruptly ended when the door burst open and two Cuban officials entered Jack's house. Ryan froze, expecting arrest, but Jack greeted the men with cautious familiarity. "Not here to cause trouble," the older officer said in English, addressing Ryan directly. "But Americans are asking questions in the village. Someone reported your presence, and now both CIA and FBI are heading to Cuba." The Cuban official's warning changed everything. Miguel, the older officer who had originally helped the band years before, now held a senior position in Cuba's intelligence service. His weathered face reflected genuine concern as he explained the situation to Jack and Ryan. "Your arrangement has been honored for 16 years, Miguel said in a low voice. "But American agencies are more aggressive now. A tourist asking questions about missing Americans draws attention. We tracked you from Havana, Ryan Miller." Ryan's eyes widened. "You knew who I was all along?" Miguel nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "We monitor all Americans who enter Cuba. When we saw your name and destination, we connected the dots. The son searching for his father. It's almost poetic." Jack paced the small living room, running a hand through his graying hair. "How much time do we have?" "Days, not weeks," Miguel replied. "We can help your son leave safely, but you and the others must decide quickly what you want to do. The protection we've provided all these years might not hold against a determined American operation." After the officials left, Jack immediately reached for an old shortwave radio hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Using a prearranged code established years before, he contacted Dave, who promised to reach Mike, Steve, and Connor. "The chords have changed," Jack said cryptically. "Beach house meeting tomorrow at sunrise." In Seattle, Cooper's secure line buzzed with an encrypted message from one of his contacts in Havana. "CIA sent an advisory team to Cuba yesterday," he told Lisa urgently. "They're not there to help. Someone high up is nervous about what might come out." Lisa clutched the phone tighter. They wouldn't harm Ryan, would they? Cooper's silence was answer enough. "We need to create a protective shield around this case," he said finally. "Something so public that they can't operate in shadows anymore." The next morning found Senator Mitchell, Lisa, and Sarah in the senator's Washington office, planning their countermove. "Public exposure is our only protection now," Mitchell said firmly, her decades in politics evident in her decisive manner. "We need to take this to the press immediately, control the narrative before others can." Hours later, Lisa sat across from a Washington Post reporter in a hotel conference room, revealing the outline of what they knew. "My husband and his colleagues were recruited for an illegal operation called Project Harmony. We believe they're still alive in Cuba, and that certain elements in our government want this story buried." Back in Caibarien, Ryan helped his father gather essential documents, handwritten letters explaining everything, photographs proving government involvement, and the original notebook with operation details. Jack carefully packed these materials into a waterproof pouch. "These must reach the right hands if something happens to any of us," Jack explained, sealing the package. "Everything we've kept hidden for 16 years, names, dates, locations, the complete truth." As dawn broke, Jack embraced his Cuban wife and children in a painful farewell that might be temporary or permanent. "I need to resolve this, or we'll never have peace," he told them, his voice breaking. "If everything works out, you'll join us later." Maria nodded stoically, though tears glistened in her eyes. "Do what you must, Juan. We've always known this day might come." A weathered Jeep driven by Dave carried Jack and Ryan to an isolated beach house several miles down the coast, a long-established emergency meeting point for the band members. As they arrived, 3 other vehicles were already parked under the cover of palm trees. Inside the simple structure, the 5 members of Crimson Edge reunited after 16 years of scattered existence. Mike, Steve, and Connor had aged visibly, but remained immediately recognizable to Ryan, who had grown up studying their photographs and videos. "Christ, Jack, he looks just like you," Mike said, staring at Ryan in amazement. The reunion quickly gave way to tense discussion of their limited options. "If we return to the U.S., we face possible prison," Steve argued, pacing the room. "If we stay, now that they know where we are, we put our Cuban families at risk. And if we try to disappear again," Connor added, "we'll be looking over our shoulders forever." Ryan watched, fascinated, as the 5 musicians fell into familiar patterns of interaction. Dave mediating, Mike provoking, his father synthesizing various viewpoints. These dynamics, which Ryan had only witnessed in old interview footage, played out live before him. Across America, reactions to Lisa's revelation spread like wildfire. News programs debated the Project Harmony disclosure, protesters gathered outside CIA headquarters in Langley, and social media exploded with memes about the band that fooled the CIA and FBI. Frank Matthews found himself surrounded by reporters as he attempted to reach his car outside a Beverly Hills restaurant. "I have no knowledge of any government operation," he shouted, shielding his face. "This is fantasy from families who couldn't accept tragedy." By evening, a plan had formed. Ryan would leave Cuba through Mexico, a safer route now than Canada, carrying the documentary evidence. The band members would prepare for potential return, depending on negotiations between Senator Mitchell and Justice Department officials willing to grant immunity in exchange for testimony. At Havana Airport the following morning, Ryan embraced his father one last time before boarding a flight to Cancun. "This isn't goodbye," Jack said, emotion making his voice rough. "It's see you soon." As Ryan's plane took off, Jack returned to the beach house where the other musicians waited with an electric guitar connected to a small amplifier. "Before we decide our future," Mike said with a nostalgic smile, "let's remember who we really are." And for the first time in 16 years, the sound of Crimson Edge echoed, if only within the walls of an isolated house on the Cuban coast. The raw, amplified sound of the guitars faded into silence as the 5 men looked at each other, a wordless understanding passing between them. For a brief moment, they weren't middle-aged men hiding in Cuba. They were Crimson Edge again, the band that had once commanded stadiums. Ryan's journey back to the United States through Mexico proved tense but uneventful. 3 days after leaving his father, he landed in Seattle with the waterproof pouch of documents securely hidden in a specially designed compartment of his backpack. Cooper met him at a private terminal, whisking him away before customs officials could ask too many questions. "Your mother's waiting," Cooper said as they drove through rain-slicked streets, "and so is everyone else." In a suite at the Olympic Hotel, Ryan found his mother, Sarah Thornton, and Senator Mitchell gathered around a large table. Without speaking, he removed the documents from his backpack and spread them across the surface. Lisa's hands trembled as she lifted a handwritten letter addressed to her. Jack's familiar scrawl filled several pages with explanations, apologies, and a love that had never died despite 16 years of separation. Tears fell freely as she read his account of impossible choices and the pain of abandonment. "He never stopped loving us," she whispered, pressing the letter to her chest. Sarah had a similar reaction to Dave's letter, while Senator Mitchell and Cooper methodically examined the operational documents, the smoking gun they needed to force governmental accountability. The following morning, they presented their evidence to the Attorney General in a closed-door meeting. "This isn't merely a case of missing persons," Senator Mitchell stated firmly. "It's a case of governmental abuse of power, recruiting civilians for an unauthorized intelligence operation and then abandoning them when things went wrong." Within days, a controlled media strategy unfolded. Ryan, now comfortable in his role as family spokesperson, addressed journalists in a hotel conference room. "My father and the other members of Crimson Edge didn't abandon their families," he explained with newfound confidence. "They were victims of an illegal operation that placed them in an impossible situation: betray their country or protect innocent people." The public reaction was immediate and passionate. Newspaper headlines demanded answers. Television debates pitted former intelligence officials against civil liberties advocates, and social media erupted with support for the rock spies. Former CIA operatives, speaking anonymously, confirmed the existence of similar civilian recruitment programs during the 90s. Diplomatic negotiations began at the Canadian Embassy in Havana, with representatives from the United States and Cuba discussing the legal status of the 5 musicians. The negotiations were complex. The musicians had technically committed treason by providing intelligence to Cuba, but had been coerced into espionage roles without proper training or legal protections. While negotiations continued, Emma Miller, now 20, nervously prepared for a reunion she could barely imagine. In their small apartment, she rearranged family photographs for the 5th time, unsure how to welcome the father she knew only from pictures and fading memories. "Do you think he'll like me?" she asked her mother, suddenly looking like the little girl she had been when Jack disappeared. "He'll love you," Lisa assured her, though her own stomach churned with anxiety about reuniting with a husband who had built another life, another family. After months of delicate negotiations, an agreement was reached. The musicians would receive immunity in exchange for complete testimony about CIA operations in Cuba. On a foggy March morning in 2009, a private plane touched down at a secluded section of Miami International Airport. Jack Miller descended the steps slowly, hesitating at the bottom as he scanned the small group waiting on the tarmac. 16 years older, his hair now short and gray, he looked nothing like the rock star who had disappeared, until he smiled and Ryan recognized his father again. The embrace that followed encompassed Lisa and Ryan. The 3 finally reunited in a moment that had seemed impossible for so long. Photographers captured the scene from a respectful distance, while FBI agents kept other press at bay. Later that week, Emma met her father for the first time as an adult. Their initial interaction was awkward, until Emma revealed that she had kept the guitar pick he had left her as a child. The small plastic triangle had become her talisman through years of uncertainty. Over the following months, the other band members returned to American soil, each facing their own emotional reconciliations. They provided detailed testimony about Project Harmony to Justice Department officials, revealing the extent of unauthorized intelligence operations using civilians as cover. Frank Matthews was indicted for his role in the scheme and for obstruction of justice in the subsequent investigation. His perp walk, head bowed as federal agents escorted him past shouting reporters, became one of the defining images of the scandal. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of the musicians' return was integrating their Cuban families into their American lives. Through special immigration arrangements, Jack's wife Maria and their children eventually joined him in Seattle, creating a complex blended family that required patience and understanding from everyone involved. In December 2010, a line stretched around the block outside a small Seattle club where rumors suggested Crimson Edge might perform. Inside, the venue hummed with anticipation as longtime fans, many now in their 40s, pressed toward the stage. When the 5 musicians walked out, the roar was deafening. Jack Miller adjusted the microphone, his eyes finding Lisa, Ryan, Emma, Maria, and his Cuban children at the side of the stage. As the final chords of Midnight Demons echoed through the packed club, Jack addressed the emotional crowd. "They said our music died in that ocean 17 years ago, but the truth is that some notes never truly get lost. They just wait for the right moment to find their way back home."